The St. John River rises in the high plateau of northwestern Maine and flows northeast through Aroostook County before crossing into New Brunswick and eventually emptying into the Bay of Fundy. Along its upper course in the 1860s, the valley contained a sparse scatter of farms established primarily by Acadian French families who had been in the region since the 18th century and by American settlers who had come north from the older Maine counties following the Aroostook War boundary settlement of 1842, which had fixed the international border and opened the American side of the valley to more confident agricultural development. By 1865, Aroostook County was still frontier in character, despite being geographically part of an older state. The farms were new, the roads were few, the winters were among the most severe recorded in the northeastern United States, and the isolation between farm and town in the deep winter months was as complete as anything the Western Territories produced. The winters of Aroostook County in the 1860s were measured at the weather stations in Halton and Fort Kent, with regularity sufficient to establish the county's climate character. January temperatures averaging below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, with cold snaps that brought readings to -30 or lower at the St. John River stations, and winter storms that could deposit 2 to 3 feet of snow in 24 hours and leave the backcountry roads impassable for days. The wood supply for Aroostook Farm was typically cut in the autumn from the surrounding forest and stacked in the barn or in the woodshed. Against the south wall of the farmhouse, where it was protected from the worst weather and accessible through the connecting shed that linked the farmhouse to the outbuildings in the standard connected architecture pattern of northern New England farm design. A farm with adequate wood supply, accessible outbuildings, and a well-built house could survive in a Aroostook winter without extraordinary measures. A farm with inadequate preparation, or one that lost access to its woodshed through storm damage or blocked access, was in a different situation. Hannah Ferris had been managing the farm on the Upper St. John alone since September of 1864, when the letter from the War Department arrived at the Aroostook County Post Office telling her that her husband Elias had been killed at the Siege of Atlanta in July and that the Army regretted to inform her. She was 41. Elias had been 44. They had no children who had survived infancy. The farm was 120 acres of cleared land and woodlot along the St. John River Valley, with a log farmhouse, a connecting shed, and a small barn that Elias had built in 1857. She had the farm. The wood supply Elias had been cutting before he enlisted in 1862, and the knowledge of a woman who had been farming the Aroostook since 1851. The specific observation that led to the subfloor firewood system came in the winter of 1864-65. Her first winter alone, when the connecting shed roof collapsed under the weight of a January snow accumulation. The shed collapse did not damage the farmhouse or the barn, but it blocked the passage between them and, more critically, it buried the outer woodshed beneath the collapsed roof boards and the snow that had brought them down. The wood supply that had been accessible through the shed was now under 4 feet of snow-covered debris, and the temperature outside was -12. She spent that night pulling wood from the accessible edge of the debris pile, enough for the next 2 days, and thinking about what had happened and what it meant for the rest of the winter. The lesson she took from the shed collapse was specific. Any wood supply that depended on outdoor access or on a structure she could not control was a wood supply that could be cut off by a single event she had not anticipated. The shed roof had been sound. It had collapsed anyway, under snow weight that exceeded its design. Any outdoor structure could be compromised by any winter event she had not anticipated, and in Aroostook County there were many winter events she had not anticipated yet. The farmhouse floor had a crawl space beneath it. The log farmhouse had been built with its floor joists set on a sill approximately 18 inches above the ground, which was the standard construction for a frost-zone foundation in northern New England. The elevated floor allowed air circulation under the floor joists to prevent the ground moisture from rotting the wood, and the 18-inch clearance was sufficient for access if repairs to the floor joists became necessary. In the winter of 1864-65, that crawl space contained only cold air. The same cold air that made the farmhouse floor perceptibly colder than the room air by 8 to 10 degrees, and that required the rag rugs and the extra insulating layer of the straw she spread on the floor in January. She spent 2 days in late February of 1865, after the worst cold had broken and before the spring thaw made the ground too wet for the work, pulling up 3 of the floorboards in the corner of the farmhouse closest to the chimney base and stacking firewood. into the crawl space beneath. She worked through the access opening she had created, pushing pieces of split hardwood, maple, and yellow birch. The dense wood she burned in preference to softwood in the deepest cold, down into the crawl space and arranging them in stacked rows. She could reach approximately 6 feet into the crawl space from each access point, and she opened a second access point 4 feet away from the first and worked from both. The crawl space could hold, she calculated, approximately half a cord of split wood if it was stacked carefully, which it was. She recorded this in the household diary she had been keeping since 1851, February 24, 1865. Opened. 2 access boards in the corner near the chimney. Stacked split maple and birch into the underfloor space, approximately half a cord. Floorboards replaced. The wood under the floor will not be accessible to the shed collapse or the snow, and will be pre-warmed by the house heat above it. This is the reserve. She used the word reserve deliberately, not the primary supply, which remained in the woodshed she had rebuilt against the barn wall that spring, but the supply of last resort that no winter event she had not anticipated could reach. The pre-warming observation she noted in February was a consequence of the crawl space's position beneath the heated floor. The house heat conducted downward through the floorboards and warmed the crawl space air to a temperature substantially above the outdoor winter air. She measured the crawl space temperature through the access opening in March of 1865, before she sealed the boards. The crawl space air was at 38 degrees, with the outdoor temperature at -3. The floorboards above the crawl space were at 44 degrees on their underside. The wood stacked in the crawl space was at approximately the crawl space air temperature, 38 degrees, not frozen, not damp, not inaccessible. 38 degrees and pre-warmed wood was a specific practical advantage over the wood in the outdoor pile, which was at the outdoor temperature, -3 in March, -15 or lower in January, and which required time to warm to ignition temperature after being brought inside. Pre-warmed wood from the underfloor reserve would ignite faster, burn more completely from the first application of the match, and produce more heat per unit of fuel in the critical early minutes of a cold morning fire rebuild. She had not calculated this in thermal engineering terms. She had noted it as a practical observation. The wood under the floor will be pre-warmed by the house heat above it. She also noted a second consequence of the subfloor wood stacking that she had not initially anticipated. The packed firewood in the crawl space was significantly warmer than the open crawl space air had been in the previous winter. She checked the floor surface temperature with her hand in December of 1865, after the underfloor cache had been in place for one heating season. The floorboards above the wood-packed crawl space were noticeably warmer than the floorboards above the unpacked portions of the crawl space. The packed wood was blocking the cold air convection beneath the floor, replacing the cold crawl space air with a mass of wood at crawl space temperature, which was itself warmer than the open crawl space because the packed wood slowed the air exchange between the outside and the space beneath the floor. She wrote in the diary, December 1865, floor above the wood-packed space is noticeably warmer than before. The wood blocks the cold air movement under the floor. This was not the purpose of the stacking, but it is what it does. 2 effects from one action. The wood is dry and warm and ready when I need it, and the floor above it is warmer because the cold air cannot move through the packed wood. She had documented both effects in the same diary entry, the reserve function and the insulation function. Neither was the result of design. Both were the result of observation. The winter of 1867–68 was the confirmation event, the most severe Aroostook County winter in the St. John River Valley in the recorded period to that point. A blizzard arrived on January 19, 1868, with 48 inches of snow in 36 hours, followed immediately by a temperature drop to -28 degrees Fahrenheit and a sustained northwest wind at 20 to 30 miles per hour for 4 days. The storm buried every outdoor structure under drifts that made access from the farmhouse to the barn or the woodshed impossible for 3 days. Hannah's main woodshed supply, which she had stacked against the barn wall the previous autumn, was inaccessible under 7 feet of consolidated drift. On the morning of January 22nd, the 3rd day of the buried condition, she burned the last of the wood she had brought inside before the storm. She had anticipated the storm's duration incorrectly. She had brought in enough wood for 2 days, and the storm had lasted 3 days before the drift made access impossible. She had no outdoor wood accessible. She had the underfloor reserve. She pulled up the access boards. The crawl space was at 36 degrees after 3 days of the cabin above it burning at maximum heat production during the storm. The floorboards were giving up their heat both upward into the cabin and downward into the crawl space, and the crawl space had been maintained at 36 degrees by this conducted heat. She pulled out the split maple and yellow birch, piece by piece, through the access openings. She had half a cord. At the consumption rate required to maintain a survivable temperature in the farmhouse in a -28-degree wind, half a cord lasted approximately 3 days. 3 days was sufficient. By the morning of January 25th, the wind had dropped and the temperature had moderated to -8 degrees, and she could dig through the drift from the connecting passage to the woodshed. The main supply was accessible again. The underfloor reserve had lasted from January 22nd to January 25th, 3 days on half a cord in extreme cold. She wrote in the diary on January 25th, January 25th, 1868, dug through to the woodshed this morning. Underfloor reserve lasted 3 days, from January 22nd through January 24th. Consumed full reserve, approximately half cord. Temperature held at 38 to 42 degrees during the 3-day reserve period. The reserve was the reason I am writing this entry. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. This was the confirmation in its plainest form. The reserve had been the difference between a difficult storm and an unsurvivable one. She had built it from the shed collapse of 1864 to 65. From the specific observation that any outdoor supply was vulnerable to events she had not anticipated. And from the 2 days in February 1865 when she had stacked split wood into the crawl space through 2 lifted floorboards and then replaced the boards and noted, "This is the reserve." The Aroostook County Historical Society in Caribou, Maine, has the Ferris Household Diary, donated in 1953 by Hannah's great-niece Margaret Ferris Webb, who had kept the diary after Hannah's death in 1891. The diary covers the years from 1851 to 1882 in annual volumes. The critical volumes, -1864 to 65, first winter alone, shed collapse, subfloor installation, and 1867 to 68, blizzard confirmation, are in the collection, along with the full run of diary volumes and a series of letters from neighboring farm families that corroborate the January 1868 storm conditions. The archivist who catalogued the collection in 1953 noted, "The Ferris diary contains what appears to be the earliest first-person documentation of deliberate subfloor firewood storage as an emergency thermal reserve in the Aroostook County Settlement Record." With the February 1865 installation entry and the January 1868 performance record, constituting an unusually complete account of the techniques, development, and confirmation. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. The diary says so. The Aroostook County Historical Society has it. It is still there. The physics of the subfloor firewood cache, which Hannah had described to herself in the diary as the wood blocks the cold air movement under the floor, operates through 3 thermal mechanisms that are worth stating with precision, because each is distinct and each contributed independently to the farmhouse's winter performance after the cache was installed. The first mechanism is thermal mass storage in the wood itself. Split hardwood, the maple and yellow birch that Hannah used in preference to softwood, has a volumetric heat capacity of approximately 1.3 megajoules per cubic meter per degree Celsius, roughly comparable to compacted earth and higher than most other common materials except stone. A half cord of split hardwood, at approximately 64 cubic feet of actual wood volume. Split wood in a cord is approximately 50% wood and 50% airspace, has sufficient thermal mass to absorb and store a substantial quantity of heat conducted downward through the floorboards during the periods when the farmhouse above is heated. When the farmhouse temperature is at 60 degrees and the crawl space temperature is at 30 whites, the floorboards are conducting heat downward at a rate determined by the thermal conductivity of the wood and the temperature differential. The wood in the cache absorbs this conducted heat and maintains its temperature above the outdoor air temperature for an extended period after the floor's heat supply is reduced. This thermal mass effect is what Hannah observed when she measured the crawl space at 36 degrees on January 22nd after 3 days of maximum stove output during the blizzard. The cashwood had been absorbing the conducted heat from the heated floor above and was releasing it slowly back into the crawlspace air, maintaining a temperature that was 36 degrees, despite the -20-8 outside. An open crawlspace under the same conditions would have been much colder. The outdoor air would have exchanged freely through the foundation gaps and brought the crawlspace to near outdoor temperatures. The second mechanism is convective blockage. Cold air under a cabin floor enters through the gaps between the foundation sills and the ground and circulates by convection. The cold air is dense and sinks, drawing warmer air down from the floor cracks and maintaining a continuous cold air exchange that chills the floor from below. Packed firewood in the crawlspace fills the space that would otherwise contain moving cold air. The wood's thermal conductivity is low enough, approximately 0.12 to 0.15 watts per meter per Kelvin for hardwood across the grain, that it does not simply transmit the outdoor cold through itself to the floor. Instead, it blocks the convective exchange that was the primary mechanism of cold air floor chilling. Hannah had observed this as the floor above the wood-packed space being noticeably warmer than before. The observation was correct. The packed wood had replaced a dynamic cold air convection system with a static mass of moderately tempered material. The third mechanism is the pre-warming of the fuel supply. Wood ignites and burns efficiently when its temperature is above the fiber ignition point. Very cold wood, 15 to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, requires extended warming time before it will maintain combustion, and the initial burning of very cold wood produces more steam and less heat than wood at room temperature. A piece of split maple at 36 degrees, the temperature of the underfloor cache on January 22nd, reaches ignition temperature within minutes of being placed in a stove with existing coals. A piece of split maple at -28 requires substantially longer and consumes the existing coal's heat in the warming process before it begins to contribute net heat. Hannah's underfloor would ignite it quickly and burned efficiently from the first moment. The outdoor wood stack, had she been able to access it, would have been harder to ignite and slower to produce heat. She had not designed these three mechanisms separately. She had stacked wood under the floor for one reason, the reserve function, and had observed the insulation function as an additional consequence. The pre-warming function was implicit in the crawlspace temperature she measured, but she had not articulated it as a separate benefit. The three mechanisms were all present. She had identified two of them. The third was in her account books, fuel consumption records implicitly, in the speed with which the underfloor would rebuild the fire after the coal was established. The diary has two of the three mechanisms explicitly, and the third is recoverable from the fire performance records. The account is complete even where it is implicit. The specific detail of the floorboard access, which Hannah described as opening to access boards in the corner near the chimney, is worth examining. Because the location was not arbitrary and the decision to place the access near the chimney base reflects a specific understanding of the thermal system she was building. The corner near the chimney was the warmest point in the farmhouse floor plan for a specific reason. The chimney base, which sat on its own stone foundation through the floor into the ground, conducted heat from the firebox upward through the house and also downward into the ground at the chimney base. The ground immediately surrounding the chimney base was warmer than the ground at the farmhouse's perimeter walls, and the floorboards above the chimney corner were warmer than the floorboards above the perimeter crawlspace. By placing the cache in the corner near the chimney, Hannah maximized the conducted heat available to warm the cachewood. The chimney base was a radiant heat source for the cache space, supplementing the floorboard conduction from above. She had not described this reasoning in the diary. She had written open to access boards in the corner near the chimney and stacked split maple and birch into the underfloor space, approximately half a cord. The location choice is recorded without explanation. The explanation is recoverable from the thermal logic. The corner near the chimney was the warmest available location, and warmer cache location meant warmer wood at 36 degrees rather than 30 or 28. The specific wood species she chose, maple and yellow birch, was also a deliberate choice that the diary records matter-of-factly. These are the hardwoods of the Aroostook forest, with volumetric heat values of approximately 25 to 26 million BTU per cord for yellow birch and 24 to 25 million BTU per cord for sugar maple, the highest heat values among the commercially available hardwoods of northern Maine. At a half cord of dense hardwood, The underfloor cache contained approximately 12 to 13 million BTU of available heat energy, at the consumption rate required to maintain 38 to 42 degrees in the farmhouse at -28 outside, which Hannah's diary suggests was approximately 2 to 3 million BTU per day during the extreme period. The half-cord represented 3 to 4 days of heating capacity, somewhat more than the 3 days she used it for. She had right-sized the cache, by observation and experience, to cover the storm duration she was planning for. She described the reserve as the supply of last resort, and not the primary supply. A full cord under the floor would have provided 6 to 7 days of coverage, and would have required a much larger crawl space, access, and more difficult stacking. A half-cord was sufficient for the longest acoustic storm she could anticipate, which she estimated from the regions where the history has approximately 3 to 4 days of blocked outdoor access. The January 1868 storm was at the edge of that estimate. 3 days of blocked access, 3 days of reserve. The fit between her estimate and the actual event was close enough to be instructive, and also close enough to be sobering. If the January 1868 storm had lasted 4 days before access to the woodshed was restored, the reserve would have been depleted on the morning of January 26th rather than January 25th, and the diary's entry on January 25th would not have been written. The reserve was calibrated correctly. The storm was within the calibrated range. This was not luck. It was the specific calibration of a woman who had been in Aroostook County since 1851 and who understood the county's storm durations. From 14 years of observation, she had built the reserve to the right size. The storm tested the size. The size was right. The diary says so, in the January 25th entry that she was alive to write. The neighboring farm families who learned of the subfloor cache in the aftermath of the January 1868 storm, when Hannah told the story of the 3-day reserve period at the spring community gathering, had, for the most part, not thought of the underfloor crawl space as a storage resource. In the connected barn architecture of northern New England farms, the woodshed attached to the barn or the connecting shed was the standard storage location for the winter wood supply, and the farmhouse crawl space was simply dead space, cold, damp, unlit, accessible only by lifting floorboards. It was not storage. It was an architectural consequence of elevated floor construction. Hannah had converted it to storage in February of 1865 from the specific observation that the shed collapse had made it clear that any outdoor storage was vulnerable to storm damage or storm blockage. The conversion required no new materials, no construction beyond lifting and replacing floorboards, and no tools beyond what the farm already had. It was the application of an available resource, the crawl space, to a need. The emergency reserve that had become clear from a specific event. The community's response to the idea was similar to the responses documented elsewhere in this series. Practical interest tempered by the inconvenience of the implementation. Lifting and replacing floorboards was not difficult, but it was disruptive of the normal floor use, and the crawl space access required kneeling on the floor and reaching into a cold, dark space. 2 of the neighboring farm families, the Pelletier family to the north and the Martin family to the south, implemented their own subfloor caches in the autumn of 1868, after the January storm had demonstrated the need. The Pelletier family had a larger crawl space than the Ferris farmhouse and was able to store 3/4 of a cord. The Martin family's farmhouse had a more limited clearance and managed approximately 1/3 of a cord. Hannah noted both adoptions in the 1868 diary. October 1868. Pelletier has put wood under his floor, 3/4 cord, he says. Martin has put wood under his floor, smaller amount, perhaps a 1/3 cord, both from the January storm. She recorded them as facts, without comment on their significance or on her role in initiating the practice. The diary was a record. The facts were recorded. The Aroostook County Historical Society archivist noted in 1953, the Ferris diary contains the earliest documentation of subfloor firewood storage in the Society's collection, with the Pelletier and Martin adoption notes in the October 1868, entries representing the first documented community transmission of the technique in the Aroostook County Settlement Record. The archivist's note uses the word earliest, which is the historian's word for the first in the available record, not necessarily the first in the historical reality. Hannah may not have been the first person in Aroostook County to put wood under her floor. She was the first to document it systematically in a way that survived to 1953. She was the first to document it systematically. She had been documenting systematically since 1851. The documentation was what remained. The Aroostook County Historical Society has it. The record is complete. The February 1865 installation was not the only modification to the Ferris farmhouse that Hannah made in her years of managing alone. The diary records a series of practical improvements across the period from 1864 to 1875, each addressing a specific vulnerability she had identified from observation or from near failure. The shed roof rebuilt in the spring of 1865 with additional ridge support to prevent the weight collapse that had brought the original down. The barn wall insulated with stacked hay bales on the interior north face after the January 1868 livestock losses that came from extreme cold penetrating the single-board wall. The farmhouse window frames recorked with boiled linseed oil and shredded fiber in October of each year after she identified the draft from the window frame gaps as a significant heat loss. The subfloor cache was the most consequential of these modifications because it addressed the most critical vulnerability, the total loss of fuel access that could not be remedied by any other means once it occurred. The shed roof collapse of 1864 to 65 had been recoverable because the buried wood was only 2 feet deep and she had been able to dig through it in a few hours. A January 1868 scale storm, with 48 inches of snow and 4 days of impassable conditions, would not have been recoverable from a surface supply. The underfloor reserve was not recoverable either, in the sense that once she had used it, she could not replace it until she could access the outdoor supply. But the 3-day duration of the reserve matched the 3-day duration of the impassable conditions, and the outdoor supply became accessible on the same morning the reserve was exhausted. The fit was exact. It was exact because she had calibrated the reserve to the storm duration, and the storm was within the calibration range. She had been in Aroostook County since 1851. She knew what the storms were. She built the reserve to match. The January 1868 storm was within what she knew. The reserve was right. The diary says so. In the January 25th entry, written the morning after the reserve was exhausted and the outdoor supply was accessible again. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. She had written this clearly and without elaboration on January 25th, 1868, and it was in the diary that Margaret Ferris Webb donated to the Aroostook County Historical Society in 1953, and it is in the archive in Caribou, Maine, where it has been since 1953. The floorboards she had lifted in February of 1865 are gone. The farmhouse is gone. The diary is there. The record is sufficient. It always was, for those who kept it with Hannah Ferris's consistency and precision from 1851 to 1882 in the St. John River Valley of Aroostook County, Maine. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. The reserve was sufficient. The record is still there. The economic accounting of the subfloor cache, which Hannah did not make explicit in the diary, but which is recoverable from the fuel consumption records across the winters before and after the installation, reveals a specific financial and practical benefit that goes beyond the emergency reserve function. Before the subfloor installation, the winter of 1863 to 64, the last full winter with Elias, before his enlistment had taken him south, total wood consumed for the season, approximately 7 cords, at a cost that Hannah recorded as $3 per cord, delivered from the woodlot, total $21. The floor had been the standard cold floor problem of elevated foundation. New England construction. Hannah had noted in January of 1864 that the floor temperature was measurably colder than the room air by approximately 8 degrees, which required the straw floor covering and the additional heating to compensate. After the subfloor installation, from the winter of 1865 to 66 onward, Hannah's wood consumption records show a modest but consistent reduction. The winter of 1865 to 66, the first full winter with the cache in place, 6 1/2 cords. The winter of 1866 to 67, 6 cords. The winter of 1867 to 68, the extreme blizzard year, 7 1/2 cords. The extreme cold and extended storm drove consumption above normal. The winter of 1868 to 69, 5 3/4 cords. The reduction from 7 cords before the installation to an average of approximately 6 to 6 1/2 cords after. excluding the extreme year, represents approximately half a cord to 1 cord of annual savings. At $3 per cord, $1.50 to $3 per year. Over the 10 years the system was in full operation. This was $15 to $30 in fuel savings. A meaningful contribution to a farm economy in which cash was scarce and fuel was a primary expense. The savings came specifically from the crawl space insulation effect. The packed wood blocking the cold air convection beneath the floor reduced the floor heat loss and allowed the stove to maintain the same room temperature on slightly less fuel. Hannah had not calculated this explicitly. She had recorded the wood consumed each winter, and had noted in December of 1865 that the floor above the wood-packed space was noticeably warmer than before. The connection between the warmer floor and the reduced wood consumption is recoverable from the sequential records. Though she did not draw it explicitly in the diary, she had made the observation. The record had captured the data. The data showed the saving. The saving was real and consistent. The diary documents it across 10 winters of consistent record-keeping. In the wood consumption column that Hannah maintained as faithfully as the temperature records and the crop yields and the farm income and expenditure accounts. The Aroostook County Historical Society Archivists, 1953, catalogue note does not mention the fuel consumption records, which are in the diary alongside the installation and confirmation entries. The archivist focused on the emergency reserve function, which was the dramatic element of the January 1868 entries. The insulation function and its fuel-saving consequence are in the same diary. In the same columns, available to anyone who reads the full run of winter consumption records across the 1863 to 1882 period, the record is more complete than the catalogue note suggests. The diary holds both the dramatic story and the quieter economic story. Both are at the Aroostook County Historical Society in Caribou. The question of who, before Hannah Ferris, had stored firewood in an underfloor crawl space is unanswerable from the available record, but worth acknowledging because the technique is simple enough that it likely predated her specific application in Aroostook County. The Acadian French families who had been farming the St. John River Valley since the 18th century had 200 years of experience with the specific cold of northern Maine and New Brunswick winters, and the underfloor storage of root vegetables, carrots, turnips, beets in the crawl space of an elevated floor house was a standard Acadian practice, documented in the agricultural literature of the lower St. John Valley from the early 19th century. The extension of this principle from root vegetables to firewood was a logical step that any farm family facing both the storage access problem and the excess crawl space capacity might have taken. Hannah may not have been the first. She was the first in the Aroostook County Historical Society's record to document it with the specific detail and confirmation that her diary provides. The installation date, the reasoning, the temperature measurements, the dual-function observation, and the January 1868 performance record. The record she kept was the record that survived, and the surviving record is the record that can be cited. Whether an Acadian farmer in the St. John Valley had done the same thing in 1820 or 1840, and had not written it down, or had written it down in a document that did not survive, is a question the archive cannot answer. What the archive has is the Ferris Diary, donated in 1953, documenting the technique from 1865 to 1882 with the consistency and precision that Hannah Ferris brought to every column in every volume of the diary. She had been keeping the diary since 1851. She had been observing and recording since 1851. The subfloor cache was one observation among many in a 14-year run of observations. When it was first recorded in February of 1865, it was not marked as special in the diary. It was recorded the same way as every other practical decision: the date, what was done, why, and what it was expected to do. The record treated it as one practical matter among many. It was the January 1868 storm made it the most consequential practical matter in the 14 years. Without it, I would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. The diary said this without drama. In the same hand as the seed purchase records and the crop yield columns and the neighbor visits and the temperature readings. The record did not know it was keeping the most consequential entry in its own run. Records never do. They keep what happened. This happened. The diary kept it. The Aroostook County Historical Society has the diary. The record is still there, in Caribou, Maine, where it has been since 1953. When Margaret Ferris Webb brought the volumes in, and the archivist catalogued them, and the most consequential entry in the run was noted and filed, and has been available since to anyone who asks for the Ferris Diary collection. The floorboards she lifted in February of 1865 were replaced and used for another 20 years. They rotted eventually, as floorboards do, and were replaced in their turn. The farmhouse was sold in 1891 after Hannah died, and was eventually demolished when the farm changed hands again in the 20th century. The diary survived because it went with the family rather than with the farm, passing from Hannah to a niece, and from the niece to Margaret Ferris Webb, who understood it was a record and brought it to the institution that could keep it. The record is there. Without it, she would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. With it, she had enough. The reserve was sufficient. The diary is sufficient. The record is still there. The specific character of the January 1868 blizzard, which Hannah recorded as 48 inches of snow in 36 hours, followed by -28 degrees Fahrenheit and 4 days of northwest wind, places it within the documented record of extreme Aroostook County winter events that the Fort Kent and Halton weather station records preserved from the period. The Aroostook County climate record for the 1860s shows several extreme events, of which the January 1868 storm was the most severe in the St. John River Valley area, in terms of combined snowfall accumulation and sustained cold. The neighboring farm families who wrote about the January 1868 storm in their own letters and diaries, several of which are in the Aroostook County Historical Society collection, corroborate Hannah's account of the conditions. Adelaide Pelletier, whose farm was approximately 2 miles north of the Ferris property, wrote to his brother in Madawaska in February of 1868, "The storm of January 19th to 24th was the worst I have experienced in Aroostook County in 22 years. We were unable to reach the barn for 3 days and lost 2 of the EUs to cold in the barn without additional bedding. The road was not passable until January 27th. This is not a country that forgives poor preparation. This is not a country that forgives poor preparation." Pelletier had lost 2 ewes to the storm's cold penetrating his barn without the insulating bedding that the animals needed. Hannah had not lost anything to the storm, because the preparation she had made in February of 1865, 2 days of stacking wood through lifted floorboards, had been the preparation the storm required. Pelletier's letter, in the Aroostook County Historical Society collection, provides the external corroboration of conditions that makes the Ferris Diary's January 1868 account credible in its specifics. The blocked access, the extreme cold, the duration. The storm was what Hannah described. The reserve was what saved her from what Pelletier's ewes experienced. She had told the spring community gathering about the underfloor reserve, and Pelletier had implemented his own in October of 1868 with 3/4 of a cord. His letter to his Madawaska brother in November of 1868 mentions it. "I have put wood under the floor this fall, as Mrs. Ferris advised after the January storm. She said it was the reason she came through that storm with fuel and heat. I have put 3/4 cord of birch under the north end of the house floor. It will be there if January comes again as it came this year." He did not call it a cache or a reserve. He called it what it was: wood under the floor. The concept transferred in the plainest possible language: wood under the floor. She had lifted boards and stacked split maple and yellow birch into the crawl space in February of 1865 and replaced the boards and noted it in the diary as the reserve. 2.5 years later, in January of 1868, the reserve had been the reason she was alive to write the January 25th entry. 6 months after that, Pelletier had put wood under his floor, and Martin had put wood under his floor, and the technique had moved from the Ferris farmhouse to the neighboring farms in the plain language of practical advice at a community gathering. It was the reason she came through that storm with fuel and heat. The transfer was complete. The technique was in the community. The Pelletier letter is in the Aroostook County Historical Society, corroborating the Ferris Diary, making the community adoption part of the permanent record, alongside the individual discovery. Both documents are in Caribou, Maine. Both have been there since the 1950s. The diary's final entry related to the subfloor cache is from October of 1875, 10 years after the first installation. October 1875, refilled the underfloor cache, new maple from the October cutting, half cord as usual. This is the 10th year. She had maintained the cache for 10 years without interruption. refilling it each October from the fresh-cut hardwood, and withdrawing whatever was needed in the rare instances when the outdoor supply became inaccessible. The January 1868 storm was the only instance in the 10-year record when the full cache was used. In every other winter, it had been the reserve that was not needed, the preparation that the storm never tested. The preparation that the storm never tested is as important as the preparation that the storm tested and confirmed. A reserve is not a reserve that is used every year. It is a reserve that is maintained against the event that may not come for years, and that when it comes is survivable precisely because the reserve was maintained through the years it was not needed. She had maintained it for 10 years. In 9 of those 10 years it had sat under the floor unused. The pre-warmed maple and yellow birch insulating the floor from below and being replenished each October. In 1 of those 10 years, it had been the fuel supply from January 22nd to January 25th, 1868, and without it, she would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. 10 years of maintenance for 3 days of use. The 3 days were the days that mattered. The 10 years of maintenance were what made the 3 days survivable. October 1875, refilled the underfloor cache. New maple from the October cutting. Half cord, as usual. This is the 10th year. She wrote it without fanfare or retrospective satisfaction. She had been maintaining the cache. She was maintaining it again. The record noted it. That was sufficient. The Aroostook County Historical Society has the diary. The 10th year entry is on the page it has been on since October of 1875. The January 25th entry is on the page it has been on since January 26th, 1868. Both are in Caribou, Maine. Without the cache she would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. With it, she had 3 days. 3 days were enough. The record is still there. There is one further consequence of the subfloor firewood system that the diary documents indirectly, and that is worth making explicit, because it connects the Ferris farmhouse to the broader pattern of thermal management that this series has traced across a decade of frontier women's practical knowledge. The floor temperature improvement that Hannah observed in December of 1865, the floor above the wood-packed crawlspace, noticeably warmer than before, had a specific comfort consequence that the diary records in a brief January 1866 entry. January 1866, did not put the straw on the floor this year. Floor above the wood is warm enough without it. The straw she had been spreading on the floor each January as an additional insulating layer against the cold air convection from the crawl space was no longer necessary above the wood-packed section of the floor. This was not a trivial saving. The straw had to be sourced in the autumn, carried into the farmhouse, spread across the floor, and removed in the spring when the cold had passed. It was a half day of labor each way, autumn and spring, plus the cost of the straw itself, plus the inconvenience of the straw on the floor through the winter months, eliminated because the floor was warm, because the crawl space had wood in it, because the shed had collapsed in 1864. She had eliminated one labor task, the annual straw spreading and the spring removal of the straw from the farmhouse maintenance routine, because the subfloor wood had made the task unnecessary. She noted it without emphasis. Did not put the straw on the floor this year. It is a single line in the January entry, and it is the only reference to the straw practice in the diary's run of annual entries. The straw spreading had been routine enough that she had not recorded it previously. The elimination of it was recorded because it was new. The new thing was, floor warm enough without it. The underlying cause was the subfloor wood. The floor warm enough without it. One labor task eliminated because the floor was warmer. The floor warmer because the crawl space was packed with wood. The crawl space packed with wood because the shed roof had collapsed in January of 1864-65, and she had understood that any outdoor supply was vulnerable to events she had not anticipated. The shed collapse had led to the observation that led to the installation that led to the warmer floor that led to the eliminated straw task. Every consequence followed from the observation. The observation followed from the shed collapse. The shed collapse had been an accident. She had turned an accident into a system. She had turned the system into a warmer floor, and an emergency reserve, and an eliminated labor task, and, ultimately, into the 3 days of fuel from January 22nd to January 25th of 1868. That had been the difference between surviving the blizzard and not surviving it. The sequence was in the diary. The Aroostook County Historical Society has the diary. The record is complete. from the shed collapse to the 10th year refill. From 1864 to 1875, in the St. John River Valley of Aroostook County, Maine, this was the pattern of Hannah Ferris's knowledge. She turned what happened to her into what she did next, and what she did next into a system that performed consistently for 10 years. The shed collapse was a disaster. The observation that followed the disaster was, any outdoor supply can be compromised. The installation was half a cord of split maple and yellow birch under the floor through 2 lifted boards. The system ran for 10 years, was tested once, held for 3 days, and was maintained for 9 more years after the test. She refilled it each October, as usual. The straw on the floor was no longer necessary. The floor was warm. The reserve was there. The January cold came each year, and most years did not test the reserve, and 1 year tested it completely, and the reserve held and she was alive to write. January 25th, 1868, and the record has been available ever since. Without it, she would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. The reserve was sufficient. The record is still there. The accounts in this series have documented women who used caves, dugouts, earth-bermed stone houses, snow vaults, bent corrugated iron, geothermal springs, compressed fuel cakes, and steel boxcars in contact with frozen earth as the solutions to the specific problem of surviving on the frontier's thermal edge. Hannah Ferris had used none of these. She had used the space under her own floor, 18 inches of crawl space between the ground and the floor joists, already present in the farmhouse Elias had built, requiring no new construction, no new materials, no new tools. The resource was under her feet. The observation was, this space is available. It is protected from outdoor events. It is warmed by the floor above. The application was, put the reserve here. The confirmation was, January 22nd through 25th, 1868. The record is in the Aroostook County Historical Society, in Caribou, Maine. It is still there. The reserve was sufficient. That was always enough. The reserve was under the floor. The floor was warm. The straw was no longer necessary. The diary is in Caribou. The record is sufficient, as it always was for those who kept it from 1851 onward, in the clear, consistent hand that filled 14 volumes of the St. John River Valley's daily account. Without it, she would have had no fuel after the morning of January 22nd. The reserve held. The record is there. It always was. It still is. The Aroostook County Historical Society has the diary in Caribou, Maine. The January 25th entry is on the page it has been on since 1868. It is